On June 9th of this year, a government report landed quietly in Washington. No press conference, no emergency address, no primetime coverage. The report was released on a Tuesday morning. It generated a news cycle of roughly 48 hours, and then it was buried under the weight of everything else competing for your attention. The report was the 2026 Social Security Trustees report, and what it contained should have stopped the country cold. The Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund, the account that pays retirement benefits to 71 million Americans, will be completely depleted in the fourth quarter of 2032, 6 years from now. And the moment that fund hits zero, by law, every Social Security recipient in America faces an automatic benefit cut of 22%. Not a proposal, not a negotiating position, not a worst-case scenario. An automatic legal consequence that requires no vote, no legislation, no decision by any politician. The money runs out, the checks get smaller immediately by law. For an average retiree receiving roughly $2,000 per month, a 22% reduction means $440 less every single month, $5,280 less every year. For a married couple where both spouses collect, a typical couple retiring in 2033 would face an $18,400 annual reduction to their combined benefits. Gone. Not gradually, all at once. On the day the trust fund hits zero. And here is the sentence that should define this entire story. Policymakers from both parties have known for decades that Social Security's finances are unsustainable. They have consistently failed to act. 42 years. That is how long Washington has known this problem was coming. 42 years of trustees' reports, 42 years of actuarial warnings, 42 years of bipartisan inaction. And today the deadline is 6 years away, and the senators who will be in office when Social Security becomes unable to pay full benefits are the ones running for election right now in 2026. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how this happened, why it is structurally different from the last time America faced this crisis, what the options actually are, and what a 22% benefit cut means not just for retirees, but for every person in this country who is counting on that promise being kept. Let's go back to the beginning. Because Social Security did not start as a broken system. It started as one of the most successful pieces of legislation in American history. And understanding how it worked and why it stopped working is the foundation of everything that follows. On August 14, 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law. The country was 6 years into the Great Depression. A third of Americans over 65 were living in poverty. There was no national retirement system, no guaranteed income for old age, no safety net for Americans who had worked their entire lives and had nothing left. Roosevelt created one. The mechanics were simple. Workers paid a payroll tax, a percentage of their wages, into a trust fund. When they retired, they received monthly benefits funded by that trust. The system worked on a ratio. If there were enough workers paying in relative to retirees drawing out, the math was sustainable. In 1940, there were more than 40 workers supporting every single Social Security recipient. The system was, financially speaking, almost impossible to break. But the ratio did not stay at 40-1. It couldn't. The population aged, birth rates fell, life expectancy rose dramatically. A 65-year-old's expected lifespan has increased by more than 50% since 1940. And the baby boom generation, 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964, began retiring in 2011, flooding the beneficiary rolls at precisely the moment the workforce behind them was smaller than any previous generation had been. Today, the worker-to-beneficiary ratio has fallen to 2.9 workers for every recipient. By the 2070s, it is projected to reach 2.2-1. The 40-1 system of 1940 is now a 2.9 to -1 system and falling, and no mathematical adjustment can make 2.9 workers do what 40 once did. That is the structural problem. It is not a political problem. It is a demographic reality, and it has been visible, measurable, and predictable for most of the last half century. Now, let me show you the one time America actually fixed this, because it happened before, and understanding how it happened and why it cannot easily happen again is the key to understanding where we are today. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Social Security faced a crisis that looked, on the surface, remarkably similar to the one it faces now. The trust fund was being drained faster than revenues were coming in. Actuaries projected the old age and survivors insurance fund would be completely exhausted possibly as early as August 1983, within months. Benefits were at risk of being cut immediately and automatically. The political system was paralyzed. Democrats and Republicans were as far apart as they are today, with Democrats adamantly opposing benefit cuts and Republicans opposing payroll tax increases just as passionately. Sound familiar? In 1981, President Ronald Reagan appointed a bipartisan commission to find a way out. It was chaired by a relatively unknown economist named Alan Greenspan, who would later become the most powerful central banker on Earth. The commission included House and Senate members from both parties, structured specifically so that neither party could blame the other for what came next. They studied the problem for 2 years, mostly in public and mostly without agreement. Democrats and Republicans seemed to be as far apart as today's legislators. And then something remarkable happened. A small group, 7 people meeting secretly at the home of Reagan's chief of staff, James Baker, negotiated a deal in January 1983 that neither party loved, but both could accept. They called it the Gang of Seven. They compromised on a package that combined payroll tax increases and benefit adjustments, a 6-month delay in cost of living adjustments, saving $40 billion, an acceleration of an already scheduled tax increase, raising another $40 billion, and the gradual increase of the retirement age from 65 to 67 over decade, phased so slowly that no one would be affected for 17 years. On April 20th, 1983, President Reagan signed the bill into law. It bought Social Security more than 3 decades of solvency. It was the last time Congress made major changes to the program. That was 43 years ago. Now let me show you why 2026 is different. Because the gap between 1983 and today is not just a matter of time. It is a matter of political structure, fiscal capacity, and demographic math that has fundamentally changed the difficulty of the solution. In 1983, the trust fund was months from insolvency. The urgency was undeniable. There was no room to pretend the problem wasn't real. Senators Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Bob Dole, Democrat and Republican, 2 of the sharpest political minds of their generation, looked at the actuarial reports and said, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own facts. They forced their parties to acknowledge a shared reality. And that acknowledgement of a shared reality was the prerequisite for the compromise that followed. Today, the deadline is 6 years away. 6 years is far enough that every politician facing election in 2026 can reasonably calculate that the crisis will arrive on someone else's watch. The senators elected this November will be in office when insolvency hits in 2032, but they do not have to vote on anything painful today. They can run on promises, collect their votes, and leave the hard decisions to whoever comes next. This is not cynicism. It is the structural reality of democratic politics operating on 2-year election cycles. When the pain arrives after the next election, or the one after that, or the one after that, the incentive to act is always weaker than the incentive to wait. And the demographics make this harder than 1983 in a second critical way. In 1983, the fix required relatively modest adjustments because the long-term shortfall was manageable. Today, the 75-year actuarial deficit has jumped to approximately $30.30 trillion, up from $26.10 trillion projected just last year, a single-year increase of more than $4 trillion in the estimated long-run gap. The program's annual shortfall, measured as a percentage of taxable payroll, is now 4.42%, the largest actuarial deficit in nearly half a century, 16% larger than what was projected just 12 months ago. To understand what $30.30 trillion in unfunded liability means, think of it this way. Social Security is mainly funded by a 12.4% payroll tax split between workers and employers. To close the 75-year gap with the payroll tax alone would require raising that rate by approximately 4.4 percentage points from 12.4% to roughly 16.8% immediately and permanently. Every working American would see a meaningful reduction in their take-home pay, starting today, to cover a shortfall that most people currently feel no urgency about because 2032 still seems abstract. Alternatively, benefits could be cut across the board, not in 2032 when the trust fund runs out, but now by enough to keep the system in balance over the full 75-year window. That would require cuts significantly deeper than 22%. No elected official in modern American politics has successfully run on either of those platforms. Not the tax increase, not the benefit cut, not a combination. The 1983 deal was politically survivable precisely because it was narrow enough, phased in slowly enough, and bipartisan enough that neither party owned the pain. The 2026 version of that deal would need to be considerably larger, considerably more painful, and would require a degree of bipartisan trust that the current political environment has not produced on any issue of comparable scale. Now, here is the third force making this harder than ever before: the One Big Beautiful Bill. On July 4th, 2025, President Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act into law. The legislation included multiple provisions that together lower the tax liability of Social Security beneficiaries, reducing income taxes on the benefits they receive. Those provisions, while welcome to retirees in the near term, had an immediate and measurable consequence for the trust fund's long-term solvency. They reduced the revenue that flows into the Social Security Trust Fund from income taxes on benefits. The Social Security Trustees cited the One Big Beautiful Bill Act as a primary reason the depletion date moved forward by a full year from late 2033 to late 2032 in a single annual report. Congress signed a law that accelerated the insolvency of Social Security by 12 months. And the same Congress that passed that law has not proposed any offsetting reform to the program structure. The 75-year shortfall grew by more than $4 trillion between last year's report and this one. $4 trillion in new unfunded liability, added in a single year, driven in significant part by a legislative decision that Congress made knowingly. Let me show you what this looks like at the level of individual states, because the 22% benefit cut is not evenly distributed, not by income, not by geography, not by political affiliation. Social Security currently provides benefits to approximately 63 million retired workers and survivors across all 50 states. Between 10% and 23% of each state's entire population depends directly on those monthly checks. In rural states, West Virginia, Mississippi, Arkansas, Maine, Social Security income is a proportionally larger share of total household earnings than in wealthy urban states. When those checks shrink by 22%, the communities most dependent on them absorb the impact most severely. In dollar terms, across the entire country, a 22% benefit reduction applied today would remove approximately $345 billion from Social Security payments in a single year, equivalent to 1.1% of GDP. That is not just a financial loss to individuals, it is a demand shock to the entire economy. Seniors receiving smaller checks spend less at grocery stores, pharmacies, local restaurants, and small businesses in every county in every state. The economic ripple moves from the mailbox to the local economy, to the regional economy with a speed and consistency that no other single policy change could match. And here is the number that should stop you in your tracks. According to AARP's 2026 Financial Security Trend Survey, 61% of older Americans say the average Social Security monthly check is not enough to cover basic living expenses even today, before any cuts. 61%. For more than 43% of seniors, Social Security provides the majority of their income. And for millions of the most vulnerable, people who have no pension, no 401k, no savings beyond what the government sends them every month, the check is not supplemental income. It is survival income. A 22% cut to survival income does not mean a smaller vacation fund. It means choosing between medication and groceries. It means moving in with adult children. It means a return. For the most vulnerable seniors, to the conditions that Social Security was created in 1935 to prevent. Now, let me address the argument you will hear from every direction when this topic comes up in Washington. Don't worry, Congress will never actually let this happen. They'll fix it before 2032. They always do. That argument deserves serious scrutiny because it rests on three assumptions that the current environment does not support. The first assumption is that the political will to act exists and can be mobilized. In 1983, it could be Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, ideological opponents who genuinely disliked each other, both understood that allowing Social Security to default on its obligations would be a political catastrophe for both parties simultaneously. That shared exposure created the incentive for compromise. Today, the political incentive structure is different. Each party has a theory of Social Security solvency that is completely incompatible with the other. Democrats broadly oppose benefit cuts. Republicans broadly oppose payroll tax increases. Neither theory alone closes a $30.30 trillion gap. A combination of both, scaled to the actual problem, would require a degree of political courage that the current Congress has not demonstrated on any issue of comparable magnitude. The second assumption is that the fix is available when Congress decides to act. It was in 1983. The trust fund was months from insolvency, but the demographic math still left room for relatively modest adjustments. Today, every year of delay makes the fix more painful. The longer Congress waits, the larger the benefit cuts or tax increases required to restore solvency. A fix enacted in 2030, 2 years before insolvency, would need to be twice as large as a fix enacted today. A fix enacted in 2031 would need to be larger still. The actuaries have been saying this explicitly for years. Implementing changes sooner rather than later would allow more generations to share in the needed revenue increases or reductions in scheduled benefits. The window for a manageable solution is closing, not metaphorically, mathematically. The third assumption is that the broader fiscal environment can accommodate the fix. In 1983, the national debt was approximately 35% of GDP. The government had substantial borrowing capacity. The Federal Reserve had just broken the back of inflation, and interest rates were falling from 20% peaks. The fiscal headroom to absorb a transitional adjustment was real. Today, the national debt stands at 101% of GDP. The big beautiful bill is projected to add $4.70 trillion more over the next decade, driving debt to 120% of GDP by 2036. The annual interest bill has already crossed $1 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office projects deficits reaching $1.90 trillion this year and rising to $3.10 trillion by 2036. Every dollar of additional spending to shore up Social Security must either be borrowed at 4% plus interest, cut from somewhere else in a budget that is already stripped of discretionary space, or raised through taxes on an economy that is simultaneously navigating 4.2% inflation and a slowing growth trajectory. The fiscal headroom that existed in 1983 does not exist in 2026. The fix is harder, the political will is weaker, and the cost of delay is compounding every year. Now let me tell you what can actually be done, because this is not a problem without solutions. It is a problem without political will to implement solutions. And understanding the difference is important. The options are well defined and have been for decades. On the revenue side, raising or eliminating the payroll tax cap so that higher earners pay Social Security taxes on all their income rather than stopping at $184,500. Currently, payroll taxes apply to only 83% of covered wages, down from 90% in 1983, because higher income Americans' wages have grown far faster than the taxable maximum. Expanding the tax base to investment income, dividends, capital gains, carried interest, which has escaped Social Security taxation for 9 decades, modestly increasing the payroll tax rate itself. On the benefit side, adjusting the retirement age further to reflect the fact that a 65-year-old today lives significantly longer than a 65-year-old in 1983, reducing benefits for higher income retirees who are less dependent on Social Security as a primary income source, while fully protecting those for whom the check is survival income, adjusting cost of living calculation methodologies. Any realistic solution requires elements from both columns. The revenue increases alone cannot close a $30.30 trillion gap without tax increases that would be historically large. The benefit adjustments alone cannot close it without cuts that would devastate the most vulnerable recipients. The 1983 solution worked because it combined both, calibrated carefully enough that neither side had to fully capitulate. A 2026 solution requires the same basic architecture. The math is not mysterious. The politics are, and the clock is running. Let me bring this to the most personal level, because this video is not primarily about federal budget policy. It is about a promise, a specific, explicit, legally binding promise that the United States government has made to every working American. You contribute a percentage of every paycheck you earn across your entire working life. The government promises to pay you a defined benefit in retirement. That is the deal. That has been the deal since 1935, 91 years. The 2026 Trustees Report is the government's own accountants saying that at current trajectories, the government cannot keep that promise without action, not in some abstract theoretical future in 6 years. If you are 60 years old today, you will be 66 in 2032, retirement age, expecting the check you spent your whole career funding. And by law, on the day that trust fund hits zero, your check is 22% smaller. Not because of anything you did or didn't do, because Congress spent 42 years knowing this was coming and chose not to act. If you are 45 years old today, you will be 51 in 2032, still a decade from retirement, still paying into a system that will be structurally different when you reach it. The fix that comes, if it comes, may raise your payroll taxes, adjust your retirement age, reduce your eventual benefit, or some combination of all three. The longer the fix is delayed, the larger those adjustments will need to be. The 45-year-old of today is the generation most exposed to the cost of the delay because they have the most working years ahead of them to absorb whatever adjustment eventually arrives. If you are 30 years old today, you will be 36 in 2032, more than 3 decades from retirement. The 75-year actuarial gap is a debt that falls most heavily on the youngest working Americans, people with the longest runway to be taxed and the most years to wait for a benefit that is currently projected to be 38% smaller than promised by the end of the century. 3 generations. 3 different exposure profiles. One problem that Congress has known about for 42 years and not fixed. The senators elected in November 2026 will be in office when Social Security reaches insolvency. That is not a prediction. That is arithmetic. The question is whether the people who send them to Washington will demand that they do what every actuarial report for the last 4 decades has been asking them to do. Act now, before the window for a manageable solution closes. Because here is the final truth about this moment. The 22% cut is not inevitable. It is the default. It is what happens if nothing changes. Every previous generation that faced this choice eventually found the political will to act. In 1977, in 1983, when the crisis became undeniable, the question is whether 2026 is early enough for that will to produce a solution that is manageable rather than catastrophic. The trustees' report was released on June 9th. It generated 48 hours of coverage, and then it disappeared. The trust fund did not disappear with it. 6 years, $30.30 trillion in unfunded liability. 42 years of inaction, and a deadline that is no longer theoretical. The question is not whether Washington knows. They know. They have always known. The question is whether knowing, this time, is finally enough.